This is the Parents in Sport podcast. Amazing guests, honest conversations, topics that matter.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Parents in Sport podcast. I am your host, Gordon MacLelland, and I'm delighted to be joined today by sports writer for the Daily Telegraph and co-author of the book, The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made, Tim Wigmore. Tim, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Cheers, Gordon.
Yeah, Tim, really excited about this, having recently read your book, The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation over the next 40 minutes or so. But can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a sports writer for the Telegraph. I'm a journalist. Cover a lot of cricket. I've also covered football, some tennis, and various other sports. And this project is with Mark Williams, who is a leading sports scientist, currently works at the University of Utah. So it was a collaboration. We were put in touch actually by Matthew Saeed, who wrote the foreword. And it's in some ways a sort of distillation of Mark's kind of career, because he's researched these issues for 30 years. And so my job was actually to go out and do lots of interviews, which was great. Talk to some fantastic athletes, to Marcus Rashford, to Pete Sampras, Steph Curry, and Steve Khaleesi and various others, and to sort of marry up their stories with the science and write it in a popular science book that's hopefully fun and engaging to read, but also is true to the science as well. So that's how we've ended up with the book.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think reading the book, I think you've done a tremendous job in, as you say, bringing that sort of real life stories and the way that's being illustrated, but hugely underpinned, by science. I think sometimes people see titles of books and sometimes perhaps have their own thoughts on what's actually included. I said to you off the show that there were a couple of people who questioned the blog post, but actually a lot of the book is really well-rounded and it's underpinned by science, and it looks at the other side of lots of the discussions as well.
Thanks. Yeah, there's always, with something like this, I guess it's kind of a seductive to try and write a kind of, if you do these 5 things, you will become an elite athlete. Life does not work like that. So there's lots of shades of grey in our book, but there are also things that do give you a big advantage, such as being a younger sibling, such as playing up, such as doing a lot of informal play, such as being or becoming left-handed. And it's actually important. And it's important to tease out the science of that. And actually, equally for some of the, you can be born lucky as we talk about, but you could also increase your, what I liken to, you can buy more lottery tickets. And it's really interesting looking at the ways you can go about doing that. So, a good one is the siblings example. As we talk about, being a younger sibling is statistically a very big advantage. It really does increase your chance of being elite. But then you take a step back and say, well, that's obviously the genes are not any different for younger siblings and older siblings. So what's going on here? And obviously there's a lot going on, but essentially for younger siblings, they always have to compete with older siblings to try and keep up. And actually, if you have a harder challenge and you fail more, that actually is better for your skill development and you can learn at a faster rate. So how can we then apply that to only children or older siblings? And one of the big things, of course, is playing up and failing a lot. So we talked with Elena Del Don, who's the best free throw shooter of all time in men's or women's basketball. And when she was 11, she was playing with 16-year-olds. That's a really good example. So rather than just dominating her age group, which is probably kind of fun, but probably also would stunt her development, because you keep thrashing people you don't have to develop. She was forced to develop by playing up. So that's a really good kind of practical lesson that can really apply to almost anyone at any stage of sporting development.
Yeah, I think there's some really good messages in there for our sporting parents listening in, and some I'm sure will be able to relate to that one about the the younger sibling, and you touch on it in the book, that the idea that they always get pulled out to play. I like the bit about the first time round with your first child, and I was able to, I guess, relate that to my own context, that you obviously took him and he had more structured play because you wanted them to be involved with other children. And the second child comes along, and that sort of informal play has been recreated at home. And certainly because of my own son's involvement in sport, he, without a doubt, has done a huge amount to drive my daughter, who's younger than him. And she just won't be left out of anything, and is difficult when she gets beaten, and has to, just loves those bits of failure. She never shirks away from it. She always sort of comes back for more, because it is going to be more difficult. But there's so many benefits in that, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually there's a kind of short-term the long-term dynamic here, which applies to much more than just sport. That what's best for a kid tomorrow is not what's best for them in a few years time. So it's actually having that kind of more rounded approach that's saying, okay, what will be better for your development? And it's very easy to just say, oh, this is, if someone's winning, that's kind of fun, but actually it's not good for their sports development. It's also not great for kind of their broader life skills, really, because if you're just used to winning the whole time, and then you encounter these bumps, or you don't necessarily have the toolkit for how to deal with those. And obviously for a lot, the vast majority of athletes, the vast majority of parents of athletes, their kids do not go on to become elite athletes. So, part of why sport is so important for them is, what are the broader life lessons they can get from sport? How can it help them more broadly? And so, that is a really good one. So the importance of having that challenge point. So there's the idea of the optimal challenge point, which is basically the point at which you learn the most. And this is when the skills you're learning and the challenge you face is basically a little bit out of your reach. It's not sort of so far out as to be kind of unreachable. No point in an 8-year-old playing with someone who's 30. That's not a useful experience. But it's optimal challenge point, playing with someone a couple of years older. So you constantly have to reach and search for things maybe you didn't know you have is really important. And obviously we talk about sport as a tool for building character as well. So again, if you're playing up, that's a really, really good way of building character and kind of learning how to adapt to stuff not going well, and kind of that process of kind of self-feedback and self-diagnosis. And one of the really interesting findings from a coaching point of view is that if you get more feedback, that might be better for you in the short term, but it's not better for you in the long term. And actually in the studies which my co-author has been involved in, and even at Premier League Academy level, it shows that, in general, most coaches give too much feedback most of the time. And there's an action bias here, probably, that maybe as a coach, you want to be seen to be doing something, and maybe the kids and the parents expect that as well. So, it's a good lesson, I think, for the parents, that actually sometimes you don't want a teacher or a coach telling you all the answers. That it's sometimes better if that does not happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know what? In a real life sense of this, I know with lots of parents that we work with, this is a really important bit that we're talking about here, about understanding what really good learning environments are for young sports people. And that isn't the coach, as you say, who is basically joysticking them around a field and shouting every 30 seconds and giving them every solution, because actually in the long term, we need players to be independent thinkers, to make their own decisions and become, self-reliant. And I think sometimes parents who maybe don't understand some of the science that we're talking about here, as you say, see that as perhaps a coach not doing their job particularly well. And I know that some of the work we've done in coach education around, for coaches in engaging with parents, they've done some amazing jobs, some coaches, in terms of how they handle the match day experience and giving appropriate feedback at the right time, remaining really calm, all in the best interest of these young players playing, bearing in mind that it isn't the Premier League yet. And yet they've then been accused by maybe some parents who are watching that they lack the passion that they do. And it shows you how complex all these relationships and perceptions actually are.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. And another thing, of course, is cliche, but often one is true. From which I talk to is, everyone wants their son or daughter to play as a striker, to score the goals, to get the limelight and so on. Well, actually, one thing that's often very good for players to develop, part of that challenge and that kind of being accustomed to failure and being able to self-diagnose, that can often come from playing in different positions. So rather than being, an under-11 striker who's fast on everyone, scores a lot of goals, feels great. Well, actually, maybe you go and play on the wing for the age group above, and you have a slightly different role, different experience. You have to get used to a different role and all of that, and a slightly different position within the team in terms of not being the sort of focal point anymore. And that will probably develop the rest of your game, and you become a more rounded player. And then when you go back to playing striker, you actually have you have more in your toolkit, rather than just playing in the same way all the time, being a bit faster than everyone else. And then you get to the point where suddenly you're not faster and you haven't been forced to develop those extra skills and tactics. Then you get a bit stuck.
Yeah, it's about having that. It's about having that sort of long-term lens, isn't it, Tim? And that long-term approach. I know with a son in a Category 1 football academy myself, and I know when children get moved positions, as you say, it can often be uncomfortable. They don't look quite as good as they do in positions that they've obviously played more regularly, which is, quite right and fair enough. But actually, again, if parents aren't given that information of the benefits of some of that movement and why it's happening and what long-term it will look like, they tend to get really anxious because they don't necessarily see that. They see the fact that their child's been taken out of the place that they were doing well and worry that they perhaps, were going to get left behind, or they're not going to be particularly good. And yet you and I know that playing the same thing from the age of 8 to the age of 18 is very rarely going to lend itself to any form of success.
Yeah, that's all right. I mean, I guess another key consideration for parents is, we like to make selection decisions that involve omitting people, releasing people. And that probably happens too early because we know that talent does not develop in a linear way. And we get late developers and stuff. And if you have a system where, you're releasing certain percentage of your academy every year, well, of course, if you're playing out of position, then you're going to get nervous because you feel that you could be, facing the chop. And if you're not being playing your best position, well, you're not probably being given the best possible chance. So it requires quite a kind of holistic point of view from everybody involved, the players, the parents, and the coaches as well. And a kind of everyone to be kind of on board that the mission is not to win the game tomorrow. The aim is to be how can you fulfill your potential in 5 years time, 10 years time, or whatever. And I think sometimes another issue is the way we judge coaches, youth coaches especially. If you want to win, if you're under league, if you're an under 11 coach in the Sunday league, well, quite an easy way of probably winning is to pick players who are old for your year, born in September or October, who are also generally bigger, stronger, faster. There was a study of youth leagues in Surrey, and it found almost a perfect correlation between the age of players relative to their school year and what division they were in. 8 different divisions. So that's showing, again, the players who are younger are not worse, but they are getting kind of locked out of the system and then hard to get back into it. So for coaches as well, it's really, it's really important to have a longer term vision, and actually to be empowered to have that longer term vision by people who actually employ them, knowing what success looks like, rather than just trying to put everything into winning the next game.
Yeah, I agree, and I think more has to be done for those coaches from a coach ed point of view, whether that be from individual clubs or even the NGBs, and we talk lots around these different bits and pieces, because it's that level of support that they need, and particularly the coaches who are coaching in lots of grassroots sports, many of whom are A, volunteers, but B, many of whom are parents who are just doing it because nobody else has put the hand up. And it's, we've got to try and support them as effectively as we can, so that they understand, some of these pieces, and don't maybe get swept along by how maybe sport is perceived by wider society and linking it to what we see on the TV.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a lot to juggle, and this stuff is, it's not easy at all. But I think the kind of slightly better understanding of the kind of conflict between short and long-term development, it's kind of possible to get to a better place. There's actually not just producing players who are better, but also is more fun as well. So, I mean, a good example of this is the power of informal play. So, part of research for the book, I went to the Bonnet in Paris, which produced an incredible concentration of elite footballers. And why is this the case? Well, a big factor is the amount of informal play these kids do, the amount of street football. It's kind of wired into them, and in street football you're exposed to different variables. You've got different opponents, different size pitches, different size goals. You're often playing against older kids. You might have a bit where it's very muddy, you can't run through, so you have to find a trick to get through that, and it's tough. You often don't have a referee, and all of this means actually that you have to be incredibly skillful, resilient, and then when you get to playing 11-a-side with a referee, often that can seem easier. And of course, street football, there's not a lot of, there's no coaching in street football. And that kind of goes back to, that is something that enables kids to think for themselves and that sort of self-feedback process. So actually at some Premier League academies now, you're seeing them actually just put kids in a cage and play amongst themselves. And it's got to stage where it's kind of trying to artificially recreate the sort of spirit of street sport in an academy setting. And that's because if you're just, passing the ball down the line, you become very good at passing the ball down the line within that artificial setting, and it feels good because you feel you've improved. But that setting does not repeat itself. In a game situation, you don't get that perfect situation, and you get that kind of spontaneity, that madness. And so one of the key, from a coaching and parenting point of view, the key things here is the importance of random practice, and how random practice is better than block practice. So there was a really good study in baseball in America. So what they did, they were training group of college players on facing 3 different types of pitches, and over a 6-week period they face exactly the same of each different type of pitch. So there seems, there's no difference there in the amount or the time of practice that they're spending, the amount of balls they're hitting. But there was one really, really big difference, which was the first group. Well, the change-ups were all random. So they would face a series of 45 pitches, and they wouldn't know which one was which, and they'd have to learn how to adjust. And the other group would face 15 different curveballs, 15 different fastballs, and they would know that rhythm. And at the end of it, the group that had the random practice, not more, just random practice, they improved by far more. It was more transferable, and that's telling us, okay, that it's the quality of practices is really, really important, and having that randomness is so important. And obviously, if you're facing pitches and you don't know what they're going to be, that is harder than facing pitches when you know what it's going to be. But harder, again, that's more challenge point, and it's better for your skill development.
Yeah, and I think we've again managed to touch on something that isn't necessarily just sort of one issue in itself, but I guess has been compounded a little bit by society, is that, even I think back through my own coaching career, which has gone over 20 years now, and it's only in the last few years where it's been more conscious in your mind. I mean, I always played condition games. I was always a big fan of learning through games and players making decisions and coaching that way. But I think we've got to the stage, as you say, like some of the academies have done, that it's really sad, isn't it, that we've had to recreate environments for play. Now, it's not as straightforward as saying children don't go out and play like they used to, you know, on the streets of Merseyside and everything else, maybe like when we grew up, because parents have got a far greater fear of letting their children, you know, go out and do that. So it is a difficult balancing act to strike, but there's absolutely no doubt how much amazing learning can go on in these unstructured environments, these safe environments, as you say, where people give their own feedback, they learn through bits of repetition, through the same situation they come up with, and if it doesn't work one way, they try, you know, something else. And the bit that stuck with me from the book, actually, and I hope I pronounced it properly, was the bit around Wagga Wagga, because that backs up that point brilliantly. You know, I've had it in my mind for a while, but it was the fact that there's a sentence, isn't there, where it says the parents feel safe to let their children go out and explore and play. And I don't know how many places people actually feel that safe now in the world. And that clearly was a major positive there.
Yeah, so Wagga Wagga, which is basically, it's a town in Australia. It's sort of and every town, about 50,000 people, sort of halfway between Melbourne and Sydney, and it's produced a huge number of elite Australian athletes across a wide range of sports. You know, famously at one point it had both Australia's opening batsmen in Test cricket were both from Wagga Wagga, and essentially the magic of Wagga Wagga is you have huge amounts of informal play, and it is a sweet spot. There's the idea of this sweet spot in towns, which is that you are big enough to have good facilities, good infrastructure, good coaching, and good level of competition, but also you're small enough so you have a system where you don't have to spend a lot of time traveling to the game. You have parents, as you said, being more relaxed in terms of encouraging their kids to play informally. You also don't have kids getting lost. So you see that dropout rates in sport are higher in big cities than in smaller towns, which kind of makes sense, because in a big city you think there's so much talent. So if someone's a later developer or whatever, they can get lost from the system, which from a point of view of obviously sport enjoyment is really, really bad. And Wagga Wagga also interesting. Yeah, kids tend to do a lot of different sports. It's not just sort of like you must just only do football. So you have that general fitness that's being developed. We also know from a passion point of view, if you specialize too early, you're more likely to suffer from, you're more likely to drop out and kind of become disillusioned and lose interest in the sport. You're more likely to suffer from injuries, from physical overuse again. So, you know, playing that wide range of sports can be really, really helpful, even if you have a dominant sport. Another thing in Wagga Wagga is that because the kind of culture of sport is so vibrant, you have a culture where it's the norm. You know, if you're a really good player, a good cricketer, age 13, 14, which you don't really get in cities, you will actually be playing in the grade teams. You'll be playing with adults, and sometimes in cities you have a very, very structured approach where you don't really get these kids to be playing up in the same way. You might move up an age group, but not like to be playing in an adult team. And yeah, playing an adult team again, it's tough. You're not going to, if you're 13, however good you are, you're not going to go to adult cricket and dominate, or adult football and dominate, but you will have to learn different lessons. And if you come through that, well, then you'll probably have the psychological kind of attributes that you need to be successful if you also have the physical ones and the skill one already. So you kind of get the whole package.
Yeah, do you know, it's funny, you sort of sending me back down memory lane there, Tim, because I remember as a 13-year-old playing men's cricket growing up. Now, I was just thinking back to the first couple of seasons of doing it. I remember the very first innings getting bowled out by one of Dad's friends from the rugby club 4-0. It was nice of them to put me in as an opening batsman at 13 to give you a go, which is brilliant. You know, I've got no issue with that. And then I was thinking about the 2 years that followed. And, you know, I would have been lucky if I barely got a run on the board. And then sort of played some county cricket at under 15. I remember going back to that same environment. It was a sort of third team of a men's side. And the first game back as a 15-year-old, and you get 100. And it suddenly becomes easy. But it was the fact that you'd had to learn from it, adapt, grow with the system. And it took a while. There wasn't a short-term fix to it. And that's where I think, support of families in particular, which we'll come on to now, is really important, that their approach, because if we do want to challenge people, there's got to be that high level, when we talk resilience, for example, we can give the high level of challenge, but there also has to be a high level of support around people as well. And families can play an important part in that, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked with Judy Murray for our book, and with Jamie as well, actually, which is really interesting, into sort of parenting athletes, and there's studies in this as well which show that helicopter parenting, as it's known, which is basically where you try and make life almost as easy as possible for your kid. You give them every opportunity. You take them everywhere. You almost tell them what to do. You'll be nagging the coach if they're not playing your son or daughter at centre forward. You sort of tell them the best way to go about it, and you're very, very kind of you're full on in that, and that doesn't seem to be that beneficial. With Judy Murray, what the heart of what she did was, it was an asking question style. So she would, rather than say, you lost today because your backhand wasn't good enough, it would be, why did you lose today? What are the things you could have done better? And that was, she told us, and Jamie told us, that was all about, again, getting them to be able to self-diagnose those problems, because you cannot be on the court and just have your mum tell you what you're supposed to do. So you need to have that toolkit. And also, she would also, the drills, well, the sort of games, they weren't really drills, they were games. She encouraged them to play all these sorts of games. You can only hit the ball in deep, you can only hit the ball in the service box, you only get one serve, all these little games, and you're kind of manipulating the constraints there. You mean that practice is variable, it stops it being, formulaic and stale, and it's difficult as well. And that's constant. You're constantly giving them a new challenge, and that's actually a lot better and kind of more realistic, like in a paradoxical way, than just saying, I'm going to be in goal, you can take 50 penalty kicks in a row against me. But yeah, sure, that can be useful up to a point, but it's about having a kind of a toolkit that says, there's chaos and I know how to adapt to it, and having that self-confidence to know that something untoward happens, but you are used to adapting. That's what you do all the time.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that you've talked about there. The helicopter parenting one. I mean, we in our work are very careful not to label parents, because it's difficult, but it is the principles. It's absolutely right. If you micromanage everything and become overly involved, then you're actually taking away a lot of the learning. And I was thinking about what you're saying, and there's a tendency from parents to make excuses for the children when it goes wrong, as opposed to just accepting that that's part of the process. And it's certainly a large part of our work is getting parents to understand how they can manage, disappointment, because it's not really failure when you're a young sports person, really, in the grand scheme of things. But it's not smoothing out those bumps. But I think Judy's bit's really important, and those listeners who have listened on the show before and have maybe seen us in live workshops, we talk a lot, Tim, about the car journey home after sport. And one of the big things we say to parents is it's so important that if we are going to talk, which we don't always think is a great idea at that point in time either, but if you are going to talk, there need to be those open-ended questions that allow children to reflect on their experience. We know if we've got teenagers that if we ask them a question that involves a yes or no, we'll tend to get a grunt. And likewise, we know that children probably won't give a huge amount away if there's a way out of simply saying yes or no. So we do encourage parents to think about asking questions that allow the children to reflect on their experience, what the best bits were maybe were for them, what the most challenging bits were, and have those conversations that that lead to a really healthy dialogue. So it's great that you brought all those to life with stories from the sporting world.
Thanks. Yeah, a couple of things I'd add to that. I'd say retaining that sense of fun, of kind of creativity, of mischief is really important. You cannot, if a young kid aged 10 is good, you cannot kind of make them feel and train like a professional athlete. That's just not sustainable. Even if they last for a few years doing that, they'll just burn out before they're adults. So retain that sense of fun is really important. And also linked to that actually is, not making it to be the end of the world. So there was a British study on Olympic medalists comparing British Olympic medalists with near elite athletes who had been successful at youth level and then had fizzled out really. And it found that one of the differences lay in parenting. So the parents of the athletes who became the super elite, the winners, they were actually much more relaxed. It would be kind of like, how do you do, how is it? Great, well, go and do your homework now. Whereas it would be the sub elite would, their parents would typically sort of more be telling them what to do. It would be kind of the end of the world, and also they would be going to the coach, complaining about things, also finding excuses. It was a referee's fault. Well, it probably wasn't the referee's fault, and also even if it was the referee's fault, well, you can't. That's not a good mentality. Sometimes referees make mistakes, and part of being resilient is, responding to a bad line call in tennis or a dodgy decision in cricket or whatever it is. And if you have that kind of excuses culture, that's not going to get you very far.
No, and I think that and absolutely, and it's really critical that we help support parents in understanding this, because the natural tendency when things go wrong is we want to take away the pain from the child. That's just a natural reaction to us as parents. But if we do it in a way that blames others, as you say, or makes excuses for them, rather than actually talking it through, or even being comfortable with silence in lots of respects, there's lots of times when silence is a good thing for everybody to process it, yet we're desperate to fill the silence with reasons why, so that we feel better as parents and our kids feel better about things. But all the time, as you say, we're undermining perhaps some of those resilient traits or some of the bits that come later. And I know from my time in education, children still take the majority of the lead on the whole from their parents, their behaviours, some of the things they talk about. I was joking today, you'll laugh at this, Tim, talking to my son about football or boxing. We're sat on the sofa and I'll come up with some random statement just because I feel like it at that point in time, the world according to Gordon MacLelland, which isn't always right. You can guarantee 10 minutes later that my son will have adapted that sentence or couple of sentences to make it sound like his own, but it's still the same principle. And you see it in those, young people that you coach, where there's always a reason, there's always an excuse, there's always, that something didn't happen. And that, and it does breed from that type of approach that is taken by parents, or the environments that they maybe find themselves in. And it isn't just parents sometimes, it can actually be coaches of teams. I joked with somebody a couple of years ago, when did we lose the fact that it was all right to say, actually, do you know what, we got beat today by the better team? It sounds really, it sounds really, really posh. That isn't what I'm really trying to say, but it seems to have disappeared off the radar. I think about 10, 15 years ago, that was fair enough. Someone say, yeah, well played, you deserved that today. And whatever. Now it's, oh, thanks for the game. And then off to another group often to make excuses why it went wrong.
Yeah, off to blame the referee.
Yeah, or anybody else that will listen to us blame it. It's fascinating how society's changed and sports changed. And we've got to do what we can, haven't we? If we know these things, we've got to try and do our best as people involved in sport to try and redress the balance a bit, because it wasn't all brilliant back then, and it isn't all brilliant now. And we've got to try and marry the two together based on the fact that we do know more now, and we have learned more as we've evolved, if we've been prepared to evolve.
Yeah, that's all right. And that idea of taking accountability is so fundamental, so important. Sounds so simple, but often just does not happen enough. And that is the most, one of the most essential things to achieving your potential in sport, but also to sort of building those character traits, which many people try and hope they'll get from sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the key way we approach our work, with getting parents to focus through those character skills. And if they develop those, and if they celebrate those, and they really encourage those in their children, not only do the children see that they value them and they're a really important part of them growing up, but actually when parents say to us, Tim, Gordon, how do you know it's all been worth it, all the time and all the money they've invested? It's like, well, actually, I'll tell you how it's been worth it, because whatever walk of life your children go into, and they've got all these skills, the resilience, the determination, the adaptability, the creativity, the self-organisation, good communicators, all these skills that they can still pick up safely on the whole using sport as the vehicle, then actually it's been a massive success for everybody, isn't it? It's a huge win-win. You can't lose then.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's about having that longer term vision, about putting those constraints and obstacles in place, and building kind of, more rounded athletes, and athletes who don't expect to be spoon fed, actually. And kind of, it's a sport as a metaphor for life, which is a cliche, but it's about seeing within this game, stuff can go wrong and stuff might be unfair, but it's my job not to whinge about it, but to adapt to it and overcome that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the final things I just want to talk about there, when we talk about, how has it been worth it? How can we make it winning the best that we possibly can, whether that's the outcome of the sport or whether that be the character development, or however we want to look at it. It's to those parents who, I guess this conversation is around the stats or the odds of actually becoming professional athletes. Because I think when we start the journey, Tim, we're massively patient. We do it for all the right reasons. We take our children off, they're involved, we love the fact we're watching them develop. And then the moment we see a modicum of ability, there starts to be a shift between the expectation and the patience levels. And there seems to be that constant wrestle, particularly as people become more and more recognised in a sport, even though they're still very young and a long way from the elite part of the game. So I just want you to share some of the, if you can remember them, some of the stats around the NFL, NBA and the Premier League footballers, so that we can take away from this as parents that can never be, although it might be nice from an aspiration point of view, that can never be what we deem winning at the initial part of sporting development.
Yeah, that's right. So, in Premier League football, only 180 of the 1.5 million players who play organised football each year play in become Premier League players. Success rate of 0.012%. In professional basketball in the US, one of kids who play, one every 13,000 becomes a NBA or WNBA player. So the odds are stacked against you massively, and there's hurdles at every part of the journey. There's also, you could just have a kind of black swan event. You could just be a brilliant player and then get you could tread on a ball. You could break your ankle, and then very hard to recover from that. So I think that's actually important to remember as well. And actually, paradoxically, we talk about in the book, is that remembering that actually is probably going to slightly increase your chance of becoming one of those who make it. And the reason is, if you remember that, you should retain that perspective and that sense that it should be fun, because this is probably not going to be a career. And actually having that fun, that creativity, that's actually so important if you are one of the lucky few who go on to make it a career. So I think one of the things that we talk about is the kind of the hyper professionalization of youth sports can be not only sapping the fun out of them, but also counterproductive even when looked at through the very narrow lens of what can I do to increase the chances slightly of becoming an elite athlete.
Yeah, and it is nice to see, and I'm touching wood a little bit here, Tim. It is nice to see that there's definitely been a greater awareness of this and a shift from a number, not all of them, a number of national governing bodies around the world, people to make formats of games, the way the game's perceived, taking out some of the results-based initiatives, particularly at the younger ages, have actually started to take control of the environments, because then, 10, 15 years from now, that's what parents and coaches will expect to see. That will become our normal sport, as opposed to, as you say, this over-professionalisation of the product, which almost seems to allure in certain people with that drive that's going to be the outcome of this, and we've got to do everything to get to that outcome. And the reality is, as you say, odds are that low, but there's an awful lot of people, an awful lot of children playing sport who don't want to be a professional. They just simply want to play with their mates.
Yeah, and that's great. And
absolutely.
Our book is for them as well. It's telling them what can they do to get a little bit better, which will be more fun. And also, what can their parents do to stop them falling out of the game too early and actually not get all the enjoyment that they can from it. In some ways, there's nothing sadder than a kid who loves playing football or whatever, age 13 or 14, and something happens and then it destroys it for them. It could be something as simple as as being dropped or bail out position or whatever, if you haven't had that experience before. So again, if you have a kind of more rounded sporting education, then that means you should be able to get more out of sport for longer, and kind of know you won't have things all your own way. And actually that will ultimately increase the amount of enjoyment you get from it, and should mean that you sort of stay in it for longer as well. Yeah,
and that's ultimately, and I think it's a really good sort of point to finish on, Tim, is that actually that is the ultimate goal, where we have got all these young players playing sport, playing with their friends, having fun, getting enjoyment, not dropping out in those critical transition years like lots of numbers suggest around the world. But more importantly, we want these people to have a lifelong affiliation with sport, because they also become the next parents who'll hopefully take their children, or they become the next volunteers in clubs, or they become the next officials, they become the next umpires. And I think, we both agree, listening to how we've talked so passionately about subject tonight, that we're big fans of sport and we want it to be the best it possibly can be.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Yeah, absolutely. And so just having a more nuanced understanding, a better sense of the journey is really is beneficial in so many, in lots of different ways. And actually we haven't talked about part 2 of the book, which is really on the sort of skills of being an athlete, and some of the technical skills such as reading the game, such as playing under pressure, how to hit a ball in 0.5 seconds as well. Other themes that we go into, and actually the kind of lessons there, I think, applicable to everyone from the village green to playing and coaching at a much higher level.
Yeah, and Tim's right there. There's so much in the book. It's a brilliant read. The transfer of talent, mental toughness, leadership, ideas for coaches. It is so fascinating, and I really encourage anyone involved in sport, parents, coaches, to go and have a read of the book. It's well worth the time and investment. So Tim, just to bring this to a close, and perhaps we'll get you back for a part 2, and we'll see how people respond to this first conversation. Where can people find the book, or the best place to maybe get in touch with you, or anything around that?
Thanks. Yeah, so the book is in all good bookshops and available in digital audio form, so all the usual places really. And people can get in touch with me. I'm on Twitter. If you search my name, that's a good way of getting in touch. I can give my email as well if that's of interest as well. But be obviously really keen to hear what people think about it, and their thoughts as we as we keep the conversation going, I guess.
Yeah, Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the Working with Parents in Sport podcast. Thank you for giving up your time, and I really hope that we'll be able to do this again.
Cheers, Gordon. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. It's been great to chat.
Thank you for listening. Check us out at parentsinsport.co.uk.